our previous 2 installments of this series, which is now coming to a close, we built the highest end machine we've ever built and decided to unleash it for our primary workstation. We're using a 3960X for now. We could do a 3970X later, but it's in use. And the 3960X is actually built for the types of tasks we do. But we also have 2 Tesla V100s that we happen to get our hands on, so we figured we might as well try them out. They're technically built for things like simulation of the universe, but we had them here, so we put them to work with Blender, editing videos, product development, and things of that nature. It's not really what they're meant for, but they're still good at it. In this video, we'll be benchmarking the insane system we built with Brian of BPS Customs, who did all the water cooling, to talk about thermals, paths for improvement, Premiere playback speed, scrubbing and rendering benefits, Blender render times, and even mining performance just for fun. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is what we've been using for years to manage our own Gamers Nexus store, and we've been incredibly happy with the choice. Squarespace makes e-commerce easy for those interested in starting stores, but it also has powerful tools to build all types of websites. Photo galleries for photographers, resume and portfolio sites, and small business sites are all easily done through Squarespace. Having built a lot of client websites the old way before running GN full-time, we can easily recommend Squarespace as a powerful, fast solution. Go to squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. So an overview of the system, you might have seen the build series where we water blocked the Tesla V100s and then we assembled the whole computer in the O11 Dynamic XL. We ended up with the Gigabyte Aorus TRX 40 Extreme motherboard, and we used the 3960X for now. We left the CPU under soft tubing so that we can easily remove the CPU and we need to revisit it for CPU testing. Typically, unlike probably a lot of outfits, one of the things that we've always been really strict with is not using our testing parts in production systems. And that's really not to do anything with aging, because a CPU doesn't really age unless you're running it overclocked in a way that's bad for it. But running stock, it doesn't really age. So it's not to do with aging as much as it is to do with just accessibility and, I don't want to use the word laziness, but just making sure that your pipeline is not impeded by stupid things. And personally, I've always hated having to take apart working systems to get a part out of it to test. So we've never really used things that we need on a semi-regular basis for testing in our production systems. This is a bit different though. 3960X is good enough. We're not going to test it frequently. It'll get hit maybe twice a year with benchmarks. So we just threw it under an open loop with soft tubing that we can pull it out when we need to and run other tests with it. And we've got another TRX 40 chip we can always throw in there temporarily while those tests run. So it's a good fit. The Quadro P4000 is in there as our display out card. The Tesla V100s do not have any display capabilities. We've set it to only do graphics. It's not doing any compute. The V100s are doing all the compute workload. And this makes for really interesting performance in Premiere. Now, a couple years ago, we did a workstation build where one, our pipeline was different, and two, Premiere was much different, where multi-GPU had absolutely no benefit for us at all, and it was really disappointing. That's changed a lot, though. Now, higher core counts do matter. We show this in our CPU reviews, where you actually get faster render times on something like a 3950X or a 9900K than you would typically have previously expected. Multi-GPU, also in the right workloads, or just a higher end GPU in the right workloads, does matter now. Not in all of them. So depending on which YouTuber you watch about this topic, they might say that for their workloads it doesn't benefit at all, and that's still accurate. But Premiere has a lot of different things you can do with it, and some of those do benefit from different or higher end or higher counts of GPUs, and we'll be showing some benchmarks to illustrate that today with 6 different types of videos that we edit on a regular basis, where they all have different issues that are Premiere centric. So that'll be fun to talk about. One other thing before we start getting into the results, I want to mention that this whole experience has been sort of eye-opening from a standpoint of improving our workflow in a meaningful way that reduces everyone's time investment in a project, but especially mine, because it means that with a faster playback speed, with less hitching or stuttering, whatever you want to call it in playback, that could cause errors to get through. There are fewer errors that make it to me in the QC process, and so it's less likely the video has to be modified one last time and re-rendered, which is just a huge time sink. Not a waste of time, because we want the content to be accurate, so it's worth it. But if we can avoid a lot of those steps by just having a faster system and throwing hardware at it, that's a win for everybody, and for viewers too, obviously, because the quality stays high. So going through that whole process has made us want to do another build you'll probably see in the next couple weeks. We want to do a W3175X build because we have that chip available, and we're probably only testing it once annually for revisits, and we just did it like a couple weeks ago. So that thing's likely not going to be retested for 6 months or more, and we might as well put it to work in a system and do another production build with it. So planning to do that soon. That'll be a fun build, and it won't tie up all of our AMD parts. It's still a really good CPU. It's just we wouldn't recommend buying it over the Threadripper parts for what we do, but we happen to have one. And then I also want to do a 7980XE build to replace my work system, the one I have here in the office, because my system's, I think it's a 6800K. It's got 2 sticks of RAM in it. It's not even 4, 16 gigabytes. I'm running out of memory constantly. And normally it doesn't bother me, but because we have an improved editing pipeline now, and because Keegan's come on board basically full time at this point, it means that if I want to preview and render a video, I have to wait for someone to be done for the day, and that's just super inefficient. So I'm probably going to replace my machine so that I can jump in on the videos while the other 2 systems are occupied. Okay, enough of that. Let's get into the benchmarks for this. The Premiere benchmarks are probably the most interesting because the improvements are in some ways expected, but in a lot of ways we weren't expecting to see as much of an uplift as we did see. So we'll start with those, but we need to walk through the videos files that we used first. We're starting our testing with the most relevant measure of performance for us, Adobe Media encoder times for video projects. For this test, we queued up 6 projects for real videos that we've published in the last couple of months, and these were all sent to render. These offer a great mix of different types of videos that we produce, but we'll play the final renders back on the screen while quickly explaining them. First, we're rendering a hardware news video. These videos involve mostly A-roll, or shots where I'm on camera, with some B-roll cuts of screenshots and OBS screen capture, or occasionally also some product B-roll. These are used to cover cuts in the A-roll or to provide context to the story. We also add our timestamps that people seem to like, and that adds some graphics processing load. In this particular hardware news episode, we also had a Gaussian blur on an object on the table, which adds some additional load. This was the one from December 13th. Our next video was the Cat Angels bonus footage from our charity projects where we built a PC for a cat shelter. This is only B-roll footage of the cats, and it went up on the GN Steve secondary channel, which you should subscribe to if you want more bonus content from us. There are no charts or graphs. It's just raw footage from a Sony a7 IIIR. 2 videos represented our most important ones. We included the i7-6700K revisit and the AMD Threadripper 3970X review, both of which run around 30 minutes and include extremely heavy charts, with the 3970X review alone consisting of at least 21 charts and probably over 100 highlights throughout the video. All of that animation burns the GPUs hard and is a good test of multi-GPU rendering. Finally, our last 2 files are less intensive. We rendered a Buildzoid TRX40 motherboard roundup, about 40 minutes of runtime, but it's entirely screen capture with timestamps and only renders at 1080p 35 megabits per second, although it's 60 FPS. Our 4K videos, the other ones, render at 4K 45 megabits per second for at least this testing, but 60 FPS as well. This is less intensive, but there's also less presence to accelerate in the Buildzoid video, since it's mostly just re-rendering a screen cap with some timestamps added to it. The other one is the Disappointment PC 2019 intro. We can show a screenshot of the timeline for that one too. Andrew did a lot of work on this intro, and it involved tons of small cuts, lots of audio tracking, and special effects added for the distortion effects seen on screen with the 10980XE and elsewhere. This is only for the intro, so we didn't render the rest of the A-roll for this video. Here's the chart, finally. The most obvious advantage is in the AMD Threadripper 3970X review, where we moved from 119 minutes render time on our original system, or about 2 hours, to just 44 minutes as processed on the Threadripper 3960X, not even the best option. We could have done a 3970X, and with the 2 Tesla V100s. The GPUs get heavy here, near 100% utilization each for all of our charts and graph animation processing in this video. This reduction means a lot for us too. To break this away from numbers and look at it from a perspective of what does it mean for a business, it'll hopefully give you some better insight as to what we're really looking for when we benchmark CPUs against each other for Blender, for Premiere, in our reviews. So for us, the way this applies, typically to give some context, I'm personally up and working between 26 hours straight on major reviews like the 3970X one, and I've been able to cut that back a bit this year with an efficient pipeline that allows me to dial it down to 18 to 20 hours instead, but the video normally only gets one chance at the end of it. we push all the way up until embargo lift. So if we find a small error in it after it's rendered, we won't have time to re-render it because there won't be enough time before the embargo lifts. This typically will lift at about 9 a.m. for most embargoes Eastern time. So I'll be up until about 8, finishing the video, and cutting back the render time here to 44 minutes instead of 2 hours means two things. Option one is, well, obviously you could go to sleep a bit earlier on these abusive review days. And option two is that we could re-render the video and still hit embargo lift if an error did make it into the render and if it did need to be corrected prior to publication. So that allows us to increase our content quality either immediately with option two or the next day with option one, because I'll have more rest, obviously. So that's all very useful and has a real-world impact to our production capabilities. Back to the chart. The reduction from 119 minutes to 44 minutes is a time requirement drop of 63%. The 6700K revisit saw similar improvements, cutting its render time from 91 minutes to 37 minutes. This one had fewer charts and had more of an A-roll mix in it, which contributes to the 59% reduction rather than 63%. Hardware news also saw a market improvement, moving from 52 minutes to 22.5 minutes, or 57% less time. We're close to a 1-to-1 render time now, where it takes a bit over 1 minute to render for every minute of length in the video on the newer system. The Cat Angels bonus footage reduced this improvement to a 43% time requirement decrease, as it was only camera footage without any timestamps, effects, or charts or graphics, although we probably should have benchmarked something to do with cats. The Buildzoid recap also only saw a 40% time reduction, as there wasn't much to accelerate or throw the GPUs at. Most of the gains from this and the Cat Angels videos would be from the CPU, not the GPUs. Finally, the disappointment PC is our odd man out for the intro. The 3960X and 2x Tesla system actually did worse here, and that was repeatable in testing. After some digging, we found that the IGP hardware acceleration from the 8086K actually helped notably in this one. This video had a lot of special effects added, and we noticed that the IGP seemed to get more leverage for application of them than the DGPUs did. The end result is that the 8086K with its IGP did better than the new system in this specific test, but obviously the new system on the whole is massively improved, especially in those reviews. Here's a plot of the 3960X build's component utilization during hardware news rendering. For this one, the Tesla GPUs get heavy utilization throughout the test. You can actually almost see when our animations are on screen versus when B-roll is on screen. Those spikes to 100% are when we're showing A-roll with the timestamps and Gaussian blur on the screen. The secondary GPU is even staying occupied here, typically in the range of 50 to 70%. As for the CPU, that's also well occupied at about 60 to 70% load. Remember that we're always going to be limited on something, and here it appears to be GPU 1. It does actually help to have better GPUs for this type of rendering, unlike what we've seen in the past with Premiere and Adobe Media Encoder, and so the gains are well worth it for this system build. And as for the disappointment PC build intro, our plot shows the 3960X at around 60 to 70% utilization during the render, with the GPUs all over the place. In general, they're around 30% or under it, with a few spikes above. The GPUs don't get much use here, but the CPU certainly does. Looking at the 8086K build, the old one, our utilization is heaviest with the GPU Media Engine. This is a small GPU in the 8086K, so full utilization is much more likely than in an overbuilt GPU, where you might hit another limitation first, but it's also used for quick sync specifically, and was, for a while, the best option for Adobe Premiere rendering, but that period has since elapsed. Premiere used to do best with IGPs, accelerated rendering, that's why we built with 8086Ks, but it looks like it's actually gained now. In this instance, we think that the IGP is responsible for speeding up the VFX applied to these scenes. Despite being significantly underpowered versus the 3960X, the 8086K still isn't at full CPU utilization, only hitting 100% when the IGP hits a scene that it can't accelerate, and that you can see in the first third or so of the render. The RTX 5000 utilization also remains mixed, but seems to sit roughly around 50% during the heavier part of the render. Now is a good time to illustrate the biggest improvement in our pipeline, and that's playback speed for the editors while editing the video. In the live playback window within Premiere on the 8086K system, we often had to set playback quality to half, a quarter, or an eighth of full quality in order to play back at a non-stuttery speed for some certain types of edits. Premiere is a wildly variable application in that depending on what type of thing you're editing, the load on different components will change and the playback speed will either struggle or not, depending on the components. So it's not as simple as just Premiere plays back fluidly or doesn't. It's Premiere with type of editing X does or doesn't. So this was primarily true with anything that wasn't standard A-roll, where we'd have some stuttery issues. Although A-roll sometimes also had trouble. We'll show some playback here, but we also have a few clips of the CPU and GPU load levels to illustrate where load is worst. The graphs have the most trouble playing back with all of our animations and highlights we do. In the playback on the 8086K system, you'll notice that it's stuttering throughout playback, even at just 1x speed. Our editors and I will often play these videos back at 3 to 4x so that we can rapidly check them without going through the whole video at a 1-to-1 pace, because then you'd just never get anything done. You'd be watching videos all day, and when it's the same video, that's not fun. Speeding it up makes it freeze almost entirely on the 8086K system, and we can see that the utilization is 100% on the CPU at times. Even at 1x speed, the 8086K system has hangs that could cause a video QC pass to miss some highlights, which can introduce errors in the content. The 3960X system, meanwhile, plays back without issue, so we'll see every single animation bar come into frame without accidentally skipping over them from a stutter. In fact, we can play it back up to a 350% total speed boost before encountering major stuttering and playback issues. So from baseline 1x speed, we can add an additional 350% speed to that and still not have problems on the 3960X plus Tesla build. In standard A-roll footage, there's not much downside on the 8086K. It does okay at full playback quality most times, but not always. We found that as a project goes on and as Premiere is open longer with more complex projects, it eventually requires more time to buffer itself and play A-roll while jumping around the video. This sounds like it would be a memory leak or a memory capacity issue, but it's not. We think it might be more related to something like memory bandwidth. The extra channels would help here on an HDT platform like the 3960X. Another clip that shows issues is when we reverse and speed up B-roll. We do this for a few reasons. One of them is we might want to get double use out of a clip without taking an extra shot, as we can reverse the shot and make it feel new. Another is that we can avoid using B-roll shots that are moving in the same direction. So if we realize that we've taken a bunch of B-roll that all pans left to right, you can go in and reverse some of it to go right to left, because it feels a bit better to get things going in opposite directions. Reversal of B-roll significantly slows down on the 8086K, where the CPU's IGP actually becomes encumbered and can't keep up. This is about 100% load on the IGP with QuickSync, and if you're wondering, disabling it to try and force utilization of other hardware never helped either. The CPU just isn't good enough here, whereas Threadripper can brute force its way through with a heavy support from the Teslas at about 50% load per GPU. Another clip is for transcoded or compressed old footage, which sometimes gets completely frozen on the 86K build. This is fixed with the 3960X and Tesla system. We thought it was a file issue, because of the way we're compressing it and transcoding it, but it was solvable with just the hardware, which is great because we don't want to fight with software and transcode settings all day. We'll leave that to Epos Vox. Where we see the CPU on the 8086K get the most playback, or the most use, is the Disappointment PC's playback, where all the VRFX slams the CPU at 100% load, with very little done by the GPUs or the IGP. The system really struggled to play back the fire sequence with the distortion effect. The fire is real, but the distortion effects are just FX added in post, whereas the new system played through it cleanly without any frame drops and could play it all back fluidly. As for what all this means, it's pretty important. We can reduce errors that get through on chart highlights as a result of improving frame rate and previewing, but also we can preview things faster, so we get faster and more accurate. That won't fix instances where the editors get confused about which H500 to highlight when presented with a chart that has 17 H500s on it, but that's not really a problem we can fix. That's something the manufacturers have to fix. It also means, from a human factors standpoint, that editing feels less sluggish and is more efficient, overall boosting the productivity and the ability to get through a video faster and move on without feeling slowed down by the tools you're working with, which is just never really good. Scrubbing is also improved here, where transcoded clips used to freeze while scrubbing through them, just clicking and dragging through them, but the 3960X handles them with fewer stalls. It still happens, but not as much. The GPUs get used in some types of playback in Premiere, and the V100s do help accelerate things. Even though it's not really how they're supposed to be used, they do help a lot, and the CPUs help in the 3960X helps in instances like clip reversal or speed modulation especially. Thermal testing is next on the list. This one will show thermals during our hardware news render in Premiere. We'll have a more thermally intensive test next, but for this one, CPU temperature runs high anyway. We skyrocket to 60 degrees right away, then hit 80 degrees Celsius. That's with an open loop, which makes this seem like a higher temperature than it should maybe be, but we do have 500 watts to deal with from the GPUs. That said, we recently used the same tube of paste that we used for the CPU here, not for the GPUs, for another project, and noticed that it had mostly cured and hardened to a point of being questionable. We might replace the thermal paste on the CPU here to see if things improve, but we can do that for a separate video. It's possible for these thermals to happen when sharing a loop with big GPUs, but we think it's also possible that the paste was too aged to be useful. A future project for this maybe, but also just kind of a good reminder that if you didn't know, you shouldn't be buying thermal paste that you can't really use reasonably, because it does age, like some of this stuff has potentially done. But we'll see, we'll replace it later. The GPUs were running at about 40 to 45 degrees Celsius, including the air-cooled Quadro between the Teslas. But the Quadro is reserved for just video out, basically. It's not doing any compute. So that's not bad overall. As for torture thermals and some power discussion, we ran folding at home and NiceHash as our two options for a complete system load. We could obviously do this a number of other ways, like Prime mixed with FurMark, but we decided these two would be interesting for people to look at. With the system pulling about 1,000 watts for the NiceHash workload, we were at 80 degrees Celsius for CPU thermals and about 53 degrees for all three GPUs, though that's with the center GPU, GPU 2, sitting idle. For folding at home, the GPUs ran a bit cooler at about 41 to 46 degrees Celsius, but the CPU ran at 83 degrees Celsius. This was about a 750 watt load for that one. And Premiere is obviously much less intensive and bounced between 500 to 700 watts, but never held those highs for very long. And that is total system power, since that's the only thing we care about here. And also we're talking the actual measurements. This is not a delta T over ambient or anything like that. But if you were curious, ambient in this particular room is higher than our testing room where we control it more heavily. But this one was still controlled for the period of the test. It was about 22 to 23 degrees Celsius for the duration of the test. And then finally, we have a couple more numbers I want to talk about before closing out. So I'll just go through this without a chart for this one. But Blender, we ran our standard GN logo Blender test that you see in our CPU reviews. 3970X or the W3175X revisit would be the most recent HEDT CPU test that we did with the Blender 2.79 GN logo render. And in that one, for reference, the 3960X only was about 8.1 minutes to complete the render, and the system we just built using GPUs only is about 2.8 minutes in Blender. That's with only GPUs. So this is a thing we've talked about in the past where GPU acceleration makes a lot of sense for Blender. Eevee has also somewhat invalidated a lot of the need for pre-rendered animations, but not all of it. People still need to do it for highest quality or for packing it into some other kind of content. But GPUs have a lot of dominance there. The places where they pose issues are, we've noticed in rendering some of our product images for a two-dimensional top-down view of something that you really just want a whole lot of tiles, and you don't benefit from the just number crunching power of the GPUs, then having a higher core count CPU is potentially, and in our testing is, faster than GPUs or CUDA in that instance. Another example of where it's better is if you are constrained on GPU memory, which we're not here, these are 32 gigabyte cards. If you're constrained on GPU memory and you can get more system memory, like say 128 gigabytes, 64 gigabytes, whatever, and your project in particular, something like in CAD, uses a lot of memory, it might help to have the higher end CPU as opposed to just putting it all on the GPUs. So those are some instances where that's true. Now, newer Blender can also do CPU and GPU rendering simultaneously on the same frame, whereas before what we would do is render frames 1 through 50% on the CPU and 51% through 100% on the GPUs. Now it can do it in the same frame. The problem is you can only set one tile size. If you want the GPUs to work anywhere close to efficiently, it does need a larger tile size. The CPU can cope with a larger tile size okay, but once you have as many threads as Threadripper has, it actually starts to impede the process because the CPU is assigned one tile for each thread. So if you're sitting on 48 or 64 tiles and it's really slowly moving through those, especially at the larger sizes, what happens is there's not really any tiles left for the GPUs to have because they're just going to do one each, and they're really fast and they burn through them, but they only get one each, whereas the CPU is much slower, but it works on however many, 48, 64 at a time, whatever it is, depending on the thread. So it's a weird problem. It's kind of funny, but hopefully in future updates, Blender can just make it so that you can give special sizes, so you can give the CPU smaller blocks. That way it doesn't just take up the entire image and hog it all, process it slowly, while the GPUs are left with nothing assigned to them, so they don't actually do anything in that case. So there's no way to split the workload on a tile once it's been reserved by the component that's processing it. So that means that it's actually faster to use only GPU and not GPU plus CPU right now, but hopefully Blender adds a way to do a tile size for CPU and a tile size for GPU independently of each other for the future. Finally, just for fun, we ran nice hash on this, and if you're curious what 2 Tesla V100s make and 3960X, it was about $2.63 total per day in mining, and that's not counting the power consumption, which is upwards of 1,000 watts. So even at 10 cents a kilowatt hour, that's not great return. So something like 73 to 76 cents per day per GPU, $1.06 to $1.36 per CPU for the 3960X, just not worth it. And if you want to generate heat, you'd almost just be better off doing like folding at home or something. So anyway, those are the numbers for that. We're not experts in mining, don't really know anything about it, didn't tune it, but ran a nice hash, and that's what came out of it if you care, just for some fun numbers. Conclusion for this, it's really excellent performance to the extent that we're going to work on another production machine as soon as we're back from CES, and maybe a second one. We'll do probably a live stream of building at least one of those, if not both. So check back for that after CES. It's really making life easier in ways that weren't necessarily predictable, since Premiere has never really performed in a way that made sense for higher end hardware. This reduces errors overall, so they don't make it all the way to the end of the pipeline and cause a whole re-render of the video, because in previewing the video now, you're less likely to hit a skipped set of frames that might jump over a highlight or an animation. It is allowing the renders to finish upwards of 3 times the speed for some of them, which means being done at the end of the day sooner, and is the difference between going to bed and not on a review day. So that's actually a really big deal for me. Yeah, reducing the amount of time spent on each content piece by potentially a couple hours, which is massive when you're totally taxed for time. So much bigger benefit than expected. We obviously knew about the quality of life improvements, but you have to remember that Premiere, for a while, was better with an 8086K or something and an IGP than it was with HEDT CPUs. The 1950X was garbage for the type of Premiere work we did. Way worse than an 8086K, especially with an IGP for our workloads. So that's changed a lot. Some of that's Premiere, some of that's Zen 2. But either way, it really wasn't worth upgrading until this year because you were better on an 8086K. So anyway, that's where it is now. It's nice to see stuff getting used properly by Premiere, and nice to see architectures that are actually good for this type of work by any company, but AMD especially coming in at the final hour of the year with this. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. It was fun to do. If you're interested in this type of content, make sure you subscribe to catch our W3175X production build. As far as the benchmarking, one note I did forget to mention is that in the tests we did for System A versus System B, it's obviously just real-world benchmarks for us more than anything, because none of it, there's not really any controls. It's a system with all of its own discrete parts, another system with all of its own discrete parts. They're not sharing any parts. So yeah, you kind of get a look at just 2 systems. If you want more controlled data, check our reviews for that. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus to get some behind-the-scenes videos or bonus Ask GNs. We'll see you all next time.